Good morning. My name is Greg Sutherland. I appreciate you listening in this morning, whether you're listening over WCAB or the internet. I'm glad you're here this morning. I'm just grateful to have an opportunity to share with you today what God's been teaching me, because that's really what it's all about. God put us all here on this earth at this time together for a reason, to help each other, because God really does want us to make it. It says that He doesn't wish that any should perish, but that all should come to that place of coming to know Him and making it to heaven. And we're here to help each other to make it to heaven. I'm not going to be able to take my clothes, my money, my car, anything with me to heaven, but we can take each other. And that's what God's called us to do. And really, what God's put on my heart today is to share with you about the call of God on each and every one of our lives. Mine, yours, every single person. God has a call. And as a people, we've had a lot of misconceptions about that, I believe, and what it means, and really what has God called us to do. Because God places people on the earth at certain times in certain places for His purposes. God's the author of life. He is the one that gives life. So if we are here, there's a reason for it. There's a purpose for it. He wants me here right now speaking to you because He has a reason. And really, I am fulfilling at least part of the call of God on my life right now, sitting here, speaking to you, sharing with you what Jesus has shared with me. That's part of the call of God on my life right now. So a lot of times we get caught up in, so what is my call? What's my purpose in being here? Why was I born? Well, that's where you've got to go back to what has God said. And God has a reason for each individual person. As many people as have lived on this earth, are here now, and will live on this earth, God is an infinite, unbelievable, powerful God who has a purpose for every trillion person that's been here. And He has a purpose for you, and He has a purpose for you today. He's a very caring God. He cares about every detail of every person's life. A lot of times the devil comes with the circumstances, with the things in your life to convince you that God really doesn't care and that God really doesn't take notice. But He does. In Job chapter 36, verse 5, it says, "Behold, God is mighty." And we know that, but it says He considers nothing as trivial. He goes on to say that He's counted every hair on our head. He knows every single thing about us. He cares about the birds of the air. He knows when they fall. He knows when they die. He knows about every single tree. We can't even fathom that. But step back for a minute and realize that if God loves the birds enough and cares enough about the birds, He cares enough about you and I and the call that He's placed on our life to take care of every single purpose and plan. Because He's called me to affect you today. He's called you to influence people today. And that's what it's all about. So I want to share with you some of the scriptures that God gave me. And I want to start with 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9. Peter's talking to the people of God here, and he says, He said, "But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a dedicated nation, God's own purchased special people." Now that's really amazing. That's us. We are God's own purchased special people, that we may set forth the wonderful deeds and display the virtues and perfections of God. And listen to this, who called me out of darkness into His marvelous light. Because we were all born into this world with that sin nature on the inside of us because of Adam and Eve's sin. Sometimes you may think, well, that's kind of unjust, but it's not, because God sent Jesus. He provided one man to make one sacrifice of His life so that everybody, all they have to do is just accept that sacrifice and allow Jesus to come on the inside of them and change them, and they're changed forever. And then they can go and be with God and walk in His presence here on earth and then be in His presence in heaven for eternity. So God is a just God. God's a loving God. But it says that He called us, each one of us, out of darkness into His light. He's called us today to come out of those places where that sin nature has developed us and trained us and brought us up from our childhood and taught us this is the way it's supposed to be when it's really not. God's called us out of that darkness. That's part of the call of God on our lives. But then once we've come out of that darkness, God has a plan for us to help the person next to us come out of the darkness that they're in. There's a plan for us. I think about many times as a child growing up, when I was 8 years old, my parents, from the time I was 6 to about 8 years old, my parents had really begun to let God begin to deal with their hearts. They both grew up in church. They were there all the time in church. They were church-going people. They were good people, but they really didn't have that relationship with God that they thought they did. And God began to deal with them and began to change their hearts, and they began to come to know God personally. And when they did, when I was 8 years old, they felt like God called them into the ministry to be full-time pastors. And so when I was 8, my parents became pastors, and they are still pastors. But at that time, that sin nature on the inside of me began to teach me and form me into ways that I wasn't called to be. And I began to watch them, and I began to watch from the outside, not really understanding what God was doing in their hearts. And that began to form in me to say, but I don't want to be a pastor. I can't be a pastor. And really that was that sin nature in me, training me to be rebellious and to reject the call of God that was on my life. When God had called me from before I was born, He called me. He chose me, as it says here in 1 Peter 2. He chose me. I am part of that royal priesthood, that chosen race, that dedicated nation. And in Jeremiah, I thought this was really precious. I was looking at this yesterday, where God called Jeremiah. And He said, in chapter 1 of Jeremiah, He said, before I formed you in the womb, I knew and approved of you as my chosen instrument. Now, God's speaking that to Jeremiah, however many hundreds and thousands of years ago, but it's true today for you and I. God formed each one of us in the womb, and it says He knew and approved of us before we were ever born as His chosen instrument. Now, God has different calls on our lives. God hasn't called me to be this. God hasn't called me to be that. God's called me to be what I am. Part of the call of God on my life is the job that I have, and I don't really consider it a job. I consider it part of my ministry. My father-in-law was a doctor for almost 60 years. That was part of his calling. He was called to be a doctor, but he'd be the first to tell you, I am a minister of God who practices medicine. He recognized the call of God on his life. He knew part of it was to be a doctor, to help people physically, but also to be a minister of God in their lives to help them to make it to heaven. And that's really what God's saying to Jeremiah here. He said, before you were born, I separated and I set you apart, consecrating you, and I appointed you. And God's really saying that to you and I today. He has a purpose. He has a plan for us, and it's different. What God's called me to do, He's called you to do something different. God's called me to affect and to have a part in people's lives that He's called you to affect other people's lives. I can't affect everyone in the world. I can't touch everyone's life in this world. That's why God has all of us. And that's why God had Jeremiah. And that's why God called each one of us. And I began to go through the scriptures. And God began to show me how He called different ones. You can go back to the very beginning. How God called Abraham. Abraham was living in a godless, pagan city. Very modern city. It was full of idol worship. Was full of devil worship. But God chose and picked Abraham. And He called him. So what was the difference between Abraham and all those other people that lived in that city? Abraham answered the call of God on his life. And God called him and He said, come out from those people, leave your family, leave your friends, and go to a place that I'm sending you. So that you, and really what God was saying is, so that you could fulfill the call of God on your life. And part of the call of God on Abraham's life was to set an example for us of walking with God. Go back and read about Abraham's life in the book of Genesis and even in the book of Hebrews where it talks about him. And it talks about where Abraham, he walked with God. He obeyed God. He submitted his heart to God to do whatever God called him to do. There was one instance where Abraham's nephew that left with him, he and his family and everything that he had was taken captive by 5 kings and their armies, so quite a number of people. And when Abraham heard about it, the call of God came up on the inside of him, and he took 300 of his servants, just 300, and went and defeated those 5 kings that 4 kings and their army hadn't been able to defeat. Abraham and his 300 servants went because it was the call of God on his life, defeated those kings, got everything back, and returned them. That's walking in the call of God on your life. But many times, that sin nature I was referring to comes up and says, but you can't do that. You can't do what God's called you to do. But it's not truth. Because God didn't call you and I based on our ability, based on who we were. God called us because of what He's called us to do. He has equipped us to do what we're called to do. Many times we don't ever see that. That's because we haven't taken that step to begin walking in that call and let God develop us and let God train us. I'm very aware in what I do in my daily life, on my job, at home. I'm very aware that what I'm doing is not just for what I'm doing at the moment, but there's a purpose for it, and God's training me and getting me ready for the next step in my life, whatever that is, and I don't have to know what that is. I can look back at my life, and I'm sure you can look back at yours, and you can see where the things that you've been through, how they've trained us, how they got us ready for the next thing God had for us. You know, it talks about in Hebrews 5, where that Jesus, in the days of His flesh, when He was here with us on the earth, He cried out to God, it says, from that which He not only wanted, but He needed. And it goes on to say that Jesus learned active, special obedience through what He suffered. And whether it's something good that happens or it's a hard time that we go through, if we let God work in us through those situations, no matter what they are, we change. And it gets us ready, and we begin to walk more and more in the call of God on our lives. I was looking at Joseph back in the book of Genesis, where, you know, it didn't look like a good thing at first that his brothers sold him into slavery. And his brothers were wicked in doing that. But God used that. He used that time not only to prepare Joseph. It says that Joseph was in slavery and in prison for 14 years. It's a long time. And he didn't ever have any hope in the natural that he was going to be set free or come out or ever see his family again or anything. But you can tell by reading there was a peace in his heart that God was working in him. And God was training him. And it says, and he acknowledges, he said, God set me aside. He told his brothers in the book of Genesis, he said, don't be afraid. Don't worry about what happened. Yes, you sold me into slavery, but God had a purpose for it. God put me here ahead of you to preserve your life. And God has put us where we are to help preserve life. I believe with all my heart that God spoke to me to share with you today. And that God put me here today to speak to you, to minister to you, that there's people out there, at least one person, myself included, that needs to hear this today to help us to make it. And we don't understand sometimes what one thing we say, what one thing we do affects people's lives, changes them forever. Just one word, just one statement, just one thing. You know, if you read in the book of Acts about Paul, the apostle, I mean, he wrote 2/3 of the New Testament that we're still reaping the fruit of today. God's still speaking through those books in the Bible today. But he was affected by Stephen, God's minister, where God anointed Stephen and he preached the gospel, and he even to the death where he preached to the people that were putting him on trial and were going to put him to death. He preached to them the gospel, wasn't afraid, was bold about it, and it cost him his life. And even to the very end, Stephen cried out, God, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. And that affected Paul. And that set the stage for him to be on the road to Damascus and for God to come to him and to change his life. So let's stop for a minute. Paul was called to be an apostle. And it says in the book of Ephesians, chapter 4, that God has gifts and calls. Some he's called to be apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, some pastors, some teachers. But it also goes on in a different part of the New Testament. It references where God has called us to other ministries, the ministry of helps, to helping people, to ministering to the widows, to the orphans, to whatever God's called us to do. You may not be called to be an evangelist, but God has a word for you to speak to the person next to you, your husband, your wife, your child, your co-worker, your relative, your neighbor next door, the person you run into at Walmart. We should always be ready in the call of God on our lives, no matter where we are, to be able to reach out to the person that God brings to us. I'm aware of a person that I went to high school with, and a lot of people treated him wrong. But the love of God that he put in my heart, I don't know where it came from. It wasn't me, but God put it in my heart. I always reached out to that person. I always reached out to Mark. I always was friendly to him. I always tried to help him. And I found out years later, after he had passed away, his parents told me, when I finally met him, they said, "Oh, you're Greg. Mark talked about you all the time." And I thought, I wasn't even aware of what I was really saying and doing, but it was God using me. It was the call of God on my life, without me even being aware of it, to affect people. And that's what God, I want to put across to you today, and I want to encourage you today to begin to walk in your call. Don't get hung up on what your call is. Your call is today, hearing God's voice and obey. When God called Abraham, it says that he got up and he left. When God called Abraham to go to the mountain and sacrifice Isaac, it says he got up early in the morning and he left. And I wanted to read you in Matthew chapter 4, where Jesus was walking along the Sea of Galilee, chapter 4, verse 18, and he says he noticed two brothers, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew, his brother, throwing a dragnet into the sea, for they were fishermen. So here are these two men. They're fishing in the Sea of Galilee because that's who they were. That was their profession. And back then, fishermen, that was a rough life. They were on the sea a lot. It was a hard work, dragging those nets in, getting those fish, selling those fish. But that's what they were. Jesus saw them, and he saw beyond what they were doing. And he saw the call of God on their life. God put it in his heart who they really were. And it says in verse 19, and Jesus said to them, "Come after me as disciples, letting me be your guide." And Jesus is saying that to all of us today. Come after me, be my disciple, and let me be your guide. Don't try to figure out what it is that God has called you to do. Just be what God's called you to be. Just be what God's telling you to be right then, who you're supposed to be, and let him be your guide. And he said, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." Now listen to this. This is powerful. Verse 20, at once, not next week, not next year, not 2 weeks later, at once, they left their nets and became his disciples, sided with his party, and followed him. And you know what happened after that? They became two of his 12 disciples. They walked with him while he was here on the earth, and they ministered. They changed the world. They changed our lives today, thousands of years later, because they simply laid down their nets, what they thought, and they left it, and they went and followed Jesus. They gave up what they thought. They gave up their ambitions. They gave up their plans to be what God called them to be. You can't really be happy. You can't truly be happy apart from walking in the call of God in your life. It's like the old expression, trying to put a square peg into a round hole. You can't do it. It won't work. You're never going to fit. You're going to always feel that place in your heart that's unfulfilled if you don't walk in the call that God placed on your life. It goes on to say in verse 21, going on further from there, Jesus noticed two other brothers, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, in their boat with their father Zebedee, mending their nets and putting them right, and he called them. And again, at once, they left the boat and their father and joined Jesus as disciples, sided with his party, and followed him. They left their boat and their father. They laid down their lives to be what God called them to be. The Apostle John wrote 4 books in the Bible. Peter wrote 2 of the books of the Bible. They went on to be what God called them to be, and that's really what God's calling us to do today, is to lay down what we think. More than anything, is what we think. What the world has taught us, what we've trained, what we've grown up, what we've thought we were supposed to be. Lay it aside. Say, Jesus, I just want to be what you've called me to be. Whether it's a doctor, whether it's a nurse, whether it's a lawyer, whether it's a landscaper, a factory worker, an office worker, no matter what it is, that you choose to set all that aside in your heart today and say, God, you've called me. I acknowledge that. What do you have for me? What do you want me to be? And God may have you continue to be a factory worker, but one that walks with Jesus in what you do. I really pray every day, and I cry out to God, God, help me to do my job today by your Spirit, by you being my guide, like Jesus talked about here, so that influences and that affects other people around me. Whether I'm at Walmart, I want to be aware of the people around me, because if you cry out, God will bring people to you. God will put you in places, and God will bring people across your path to affect. And when you have that word from God for them, it changes them. You may not ever see it. You may not ever realize it, but one day when we get to heaven, we're going to be shocked at the number of people that we affected and we didn't even know it. We may not have even been aware they ever existed, but one thing we said, one thing we did affected people. That's why I'm aware of what I do when I'm in the grocery store or I'm in Lowe's or wherever I am, that I'm aware of having the people around me in my heart, because I am a minister. And I want them to be changed, and I want them to be affected, and I want them to make it to heaven. And when you start thinking that way, the things in the world around us, the things that we go through seem petty, because there's a higher purpose, there's a higher call, there's a bigger reason to do what we're doing. There's plenty of things in the natural that I could do today, but I couldn't do today because I know God's called me to be here. I couldn't do them in peace. I couldn't do them by the Spirit of God because God's called me to be here today, speaking to you, giving you the word from God that's for you, that's for me, so that we can be what God's always called us to be. God is the master author, the master constructor, the master builder who knows how everything's supposed to fit together. It says that his gifts are varied. It says that we're like a body. We can't, and he says you can't all be a finger, you can't all be an eye or an ear, and you can't think that because I'm not an eye, I'm not anything. My dad uses the example all the time. Your little toe, you may not pay attention to it, but if you hit that little toe in the middle of the night, every part of your body is concerned about that little toe, because that little toe has a purpose. There's a purpose. When we don't have part of our body, it affects us. There's a purpose for every single part of us. There's a purpose for my thumbs, my fingers, my eyes. God gave us 2 eyes, not just one, for a reason. God had a purpose for everything. And so in the body of Christ, God's called us to walk together. I can't be you. You can't be me. God's called me to be a part of his body for the role, for the purpose he's called me to be. And if I don't walk in that, it affects the body. I don't want to affect the body for bad. I want to affect the body. I want to be able to help the next member, the next person, to be able to do their function, to be able to do what God's called them to do. I don't want to be a hindrance. I want to be a help. So as you're going through your day today, be aware, Jesus, what do you want me to do today? What is it? If you're cutting grass, or you're typing on the computer, or you're having a video meeting, or whatever you're doing, Jesus, what are you calling me to do? What are you calling me to say? How do you want me to help these people? And that's what God really has for us. But let's don't be like Jonah that ran from the call of God on his life. Let's don't be like King Saul that God called to be king and he didn't obey what God had for him. Let's don't be like those, but let's be like David. God called him to be a shepherd. He put his whole heart into being a shepherd. But while he was a shepherd, he developed that relationship with God out there with those sheep. He was by himself with those sheep out there in the middle of the wilderness, taking care of the sheep, but developing his relationship with God. That's where a lot of the Psalms came from, is David just pouring his heart out to God out there in the wilderness. That's what God's called us to be like. As we're doing what God's called us to do, developing that relationship with him so that we can take that next step. David developed his relationship with God so that when it came time to take that next step to kill the giant Goliath, he was ready. And so when it came to take the next step to be king of Israel, he was ready. It says that David was a man after God's own heart. And when David missed it, he repented. He got back into fellowship with God, and that's what God's called us to be. Don't look at your natural ability and say, but I can't do that. Because really what's behind that is not that I can't, but I don't feel like I don't think I have the ability to do that. Again, God didn't call us for our ability. God called us because he has a plan and he's designated us. And truthfully, he's put the ability on the inside of us. But until we start to step out there in the call on our life, trusting in God with our whole heart, we're never going to see that ability, that gift develop. God wants to develop it. It's just like we didn't learn algebra in kindergarten. We learned 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We didn't learn how to write an essay in kindergarten. We learned A, B, C, D. It developed. We developed over the years. God develops us like he developed David, like he developed Daniel as a young man. He was probably 12 or 13 when he went into the court in Babylon to stand before the king. But God developed him. God was training him. And you can see that gift and that call of God on his life as he let God develop him. He was called to be one of the leaders of that country. He was the head of that country, just below the king by the end of it. So he had a natural job, so to speak, but he was a minister of God who gave the word of the Lord to kings who influenced nations and millions of people. He gave the word of the Lord, ministered to them by the Spirit of God. And God's called us to do that, whether it's with your coworkers, your family, your friends, whatever it is today. Stop. Ask Jesus, what do you want me to do today? What's the call of God on my life today? So that I can be what you call me to be, so that I can fulfill the plan that you wrote in my book before I was ever born. There's a book out there for you. There's a book out there for me in heaven. God's plan, his call is written in that book. And he's waiting to see us fulfill that call. And I want to fulfill what's written in my book on that page for today, so that when I get to heaven, God can say, well done, my good and faithful servant. And I want you to be able to hear that one day in heaven, that God say that to you, that you fulfilled the call of God on your life. So I'm praying for you today. Pray for me today that I can walk in the call of God on my life. Thank you for joining us. We're here on WCAB every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, from 8:30 to 9. You can watch us on the internet at wordoffaithfellowship.org. You can see all our radio programs there. Thank you for joining us. God loves you and I love you, and have a great day.